election would be constituted like econ men working on Mark. The Fed made credit easy while establishment newspapers hyped what riches could be made in the stock market. Now, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 would not have passed unless a few people died. As Nathan Mayer Rothschild once said, "I care not what the puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." So controlling the banks was the key and the thing that was essential in order for their plan to work. So this is what happened in April 15, 1912. Benjamin Guggenheim opposed the Federal Reserve Bank, as well as Isa Strauss and Jacob Astor. All three of these men were aboard the Titanic when it sank, and all three of them died on that night. Now, did you know that the sinking of the Titanic led to the actual creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve? The novel Futility and 1898 creation of Morgan Robertson detailed the sinking of an unsinkable ship, the largest vessel afloat. This imaginary ship was named Titan, and it collided with an iceberg during April, resulting in a high loss of life because the ship carried too few lifeboats. 14 years later, with uncanny similarities, the real ship Titanic recreated what happened in the novel. The two ships had almost identical names. Both recreated what had happened in the novel, and both were touted as the largest ships at sea. Both collided with icebergs in April, and both resulted in many deaths due to a shortage of lifeboats. Plus, both had strikingly similar floor plans and technical descriptions. Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Strauss, and the head of Macy's department stores, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest men in the world, were all killed when it sank. Those three opposed the Federal Reserve System, and if they had not died, the Federal Reserve System would have never become a real thing. As the New York Times said on November 24, 1907, "I am glad to see that in the midst of all this financial turmoil, Mr. Morgan's name has not been among the celebrities. He seems to have kept his hands clean and his reputation clear of any dishonor. He would make a good chairman for a common council of people. He is a man of brains and would make a good leader." That's what President Wilson said in regards to John Pierpont Morgan. Now, some will dismiss this completely, say that there is nothing about it that should raise any suspicion, and that all of this is ridiculous and could be established as a conspiracy. But before you do, please look at how the Federal Reserve System got started and why. The Federal Reserve System actually began in November of 1910. Six men began a meeting in order to propose the Federal Reserve System. In November 1910, six men, Nelson Aldrich, Arthur Piatt Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg met at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets, and participants did not admit that the meeting occurred until the 1930s. But the plan written on Jekyll Island laid a foundation for what would eventually be the Federal Reserve System we know today. These are the gentlemen that were meet on the meeting. So again, President Wilson is probably known and described as one of the most intelligent presidents in today's history. However, they also say that Wilson's agenda was to battle the bankers. They proposed that Wilson in June of 1913 appear personally before Congress again and call for a sweeping bank reform, in which he asked and endorsed Democratic proposal for decentralized bank in government hands and opposed Republican demands for a huge private bank with 15 branches. And then came the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, in which President Wilson appealed to the sovereign people and, most importantly, said that economic legislation between Civil War and that this was the New Deal. So as you can see, Wilson clearly had an interest in regards to the Federal Reserve Act and making sure it was passed. And the American banking system before 1913 was as follows. Like many Americans, these men were concerned with financial panics, which had disrupted economic activity in the U.S. periodically during the 19th century. Nationwide panics occurred on the average of every 15 years, and these panics forced financial institutions to suspend operations, triggering long and deep recessions. American banks held large required reserves of cash, but these reserves were scattered throughout the nation, held in the vaults of thousands of banks or as deposits in financial institutions and designated reserves in central reserve cities. During crises, they became frozen in place, preventing them from being used to alleviate the situation. During booms, banks' excess reserves tended to flow toward big cities, especially New York, where bankers invested them in call loans, which were loans repayable on demand to brokers. The brokers in turn loaned the funds to investors speculating in equity markets, whose stock purchases served as collateral for transactions. This American system made bank reserves immobile and equity markets volatile, a recipe for financial instability. If we were to follow the European banking model, on the other hand, in contrast, the bankers invested much of their portfolio in short-term loans to merchants and manufacturers. This commercial paper directly financed commerce and industry while providing banks with assets that they could quickly convert to cash during a crisis. These loans remained liquid for several reasons. First, borrowers paid financial institutions, typically banks with which they had long-standing relationships, to guarantee repayment in case the borrowers could not meet their financial obligations. Second, the loans funded merchandise in the process of production and sale, and that merchandise served as collateral that should borrowers default. And the Jekyll Island participants also worried about the inelastic supply of currency in the US. The value of the dollar was linked to gold, and the quantity of currency available was linked to the supply of a special series of federal government bonds. The supply of currency neither expanded nor contracted, with seasonal changes in demands for cash, such as the fall harvest or the holiday shopping season, causing interest rates to vary substantially from one month to the next. The inelastic supply of currency and limited supplies of gold also contributed to the long and painful deflations. So, back to the meeting. The results were that by the end of their time in Jekyll Island, Ulrich and his colleagues had developed a plan for a reserve association of America, a single central bank with 15 branches across the country. Each branch would be governed by boards of directors elected by the member of banks in each district, with larger banks getting more votes. The branches would be responsible for holding the reserves of their member banks, issuing currency, discounting commercial paper, and transferring balance between branches, as well as the check clearing and collection. The national body would set discount rates for the system as a whole and buy and sell securities. Shortly after returning home, Aldrich became ill and was unable to write the group's final report. So Vanderlip and Strong traveled to Washington to get the plan ready for Congress. Aldrich presented it to the National Monetary Commission in January 1911 without telling the commission members how the plan had been developed. A final report, along with the legislative text, went to Congress a year later with a few minor changes, including naming the new institution the National Reserve Association. So scientific in its method and democratic in this control. That was the idea. The banks couldn't control the U.S. money under the old system, so they created a fiat currency in which they can control the U.S. money supply and ensure their wealth at the same time. So, as you can see, this was the joke. This was the bottom line in terms of what was the deal that they were going to receive. The reality of how money is created today differs from the description found in some economic textbooks. Rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. So this is how money flows now in the US. What are bonds the other banks do not purchase? The Federal Reserve purchases. The Federal Reserve can experience a power that the Treasury cannot. It can simply print the money from nothing, but it creates this money as public debt. The government's liability is the Fed. And that being said, we fall into this circular situation in which the more money we start printing, the more we add to the debt and the less they have to pay, making money for themselves and adding onto the national debt, making it impossible to pay at the end of the day. Now, what is fiat money? Fiat money is currency which derives its value from government regulation or law. It differs from commodity money, which is based on a good, often a precious metal such as gold or silver, which has uses other than as a medium of exchange. So money creation in the U.S. is now up to the Federal Reserve System. And in the U.S., the Federal Reserve prints Federal Reserve notes, which function as legal tender or fiat money. This money essentially represents debt to the Fed. U.S. coins, however, are produced by the U.S. Treasury and do not represent debt to private banks. However, most people carry cash rather than coins, and that's to be normal, I would say. In Origins of the Federal Reserve, Economic Stability says that the gold standard as an alternative to a central bank should be a better alternative, because in a gold standard, the value of the currency is fixed in terms of the quantity of gold and not what can be printed and added onto a debt. The gold standard sets the money supply and price level generally within the limited central bank. So again, this is a short graph to represent the purchasing power of the US dollar from 1913 all the way to 2013. Now, before 1913, we had little or no national debt. But as time went by and with the introduction of the Federal Reserve System, all we see is the rising amount of debt that we are in regards to national debt. In 1964, the minimum wage was 5 silver quarters, and in 2016, 5 silver quarters have met a value of $15 to $55. We don't need to raise the minimum wage. We need to have money. Now, what is fiat money again? It's legalized government money. And as John Maynard Keynes said, by a continuing process of inflation, government can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Hence inflation. Now, what do other people say about the Federal Reserve? President Woodrow Wilson said, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated, and the growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and the duress of small groups of dominant men." And this can also be reflected on Thomas Jefferson quote when he said, "I believe that banking institutions are dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless and homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." So there have been many campaigns that say that privatized institutions are not good for the citizens. And in conclusion, we ask that we should end the Fed. The gold standard did not collapse. Governments abolished it in order to pave the way for inflation. Solemn pledges were broken and retroactive laws were promulgated. Provisions of the constitutions and bills of rights were openly defied, and hosts of servile writers praised what the government had done and hailed the dawn of the fiat money millennium. That's what Ludwig von Mises said. So in this picture, we can see a campaign of propaganda in which it said, who is war really good for? And this is just showing how much money really can be made out of a war and how all of that money doesn't really help the economy. It just goes to a certain amount of individuals. Congressman Louis T. McFadden said, "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. Mr. Chairman, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of the United States did not perceive that a world system was being set up there and that this country was to supply financial power to an international superstate, a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure." This speech was delivered to the House of Representatives. So again, how does this all tie back to the Titanic? Well, if we were to compare the events that happened in the Titanic and the novel Wreck of the Titan that was written about 14 years earlier, we ask ourselves, can life really imitate art? Well, it does when you are the artist. The novella Wreck of the Titan was written in 1998 by U.S. writer Morgan Robertson, and it showed some eerie similarities to the famed story of the sinking of the Titanic. Just how many similarities? Let's take a look. First, while the name may just be missing a few letters, the Titan, the name of the boat in the book in the Wreck of the Titan was described as the largest ship of its day and was indeed called the Titan. The size was very similar. It was only differentiated in about 25 meters longer in the Titanic, and the date is also in April. Both ships were described as unsinkable, and they both hit an iceberg when they went underwater in mid-April. In terms of speed, they were both capable of over 20 knots. And in regards to safety, the reason why so many people died in both stories was due to the lack of lifeboats for all of the passengers. So if we were to take into account these eerie coincidences, strike as borderline creepy, but was Robertson really some prescient writer? So that being said, did you know that 3 of the wealthiest men on earth, whom were against the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, which I mentioned previously, were on the boat and died? Could this be a warning by the author? An interesting fact should be that J.P. Morgan was booked on the voyage but canceled at the last second. And the friend of J.P. Morgan, Milton Hersey, also canceled at the last moment and survived to build the Hersey food empire. So just to think about it, why would they cancel if it was one of the biggest achievements in American history? Why would they just say they didn't want to go anymore? That would be if they had some inside knowledge on what was going to happen on that night. So that being said, if we were to look at all the newspapers that said all the deaths and how everything was just an accident, but again, if you compare it back to the wreck of the Titan 14 years earlier, then can we really call it an accident? Can we really say that it was a catastrophe? It was all a plot. The meeting took place in November of 1910. And why did it take place until December of 1923 before it was created? Well, that's because President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 1930, culminating the 3 years of discussion and debate over the development of a central bank. In this cartoon, we can see what are the effects of having a centralized banking system. Tragic story indeed. So again, the US dollar retains the world reserve currency status thanks to Saudi Arabia and the deals they have in regards with oil. The bankers lied about the nature of the Federal Reserve. As we were to ask, America was established not to create wealth, but to realize a vision, to realize an ideal, and to discover and maintain liberty among men. Or was it? A small loss versus unlimited money gained the ability for the US to print money. But again, how much does it really cost for us to print money? Why should we have to pay for money that is our own? And that's because that's the way the Federal Reserve System made things now. So in regards to central bank debt based on fiat money, the few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, as Rothschild said once. And if there are no further questions, or please feel free to leave comments, suggestions for the next video. We thank you for watching, and this will be all. Bye.